Hello and welcome to the Your Parenting Mojo podcast. I have to say, I'm really excited about this episode, which is on the topic of validation. And I'm here with Dr. Caroline Fleck, who has recently published a book called Validation. And I want to say right here at the outset that I found the book both incredibly useful and extraordinarily frustrating. Dr. Fleck's publicist reached out to me about the book a couple of months ago, and I gave my usual response, which is that I'm cautiously interested. Perhaps it won't surprise you to know that I don't invite guests on the podcast if their message isn't reasonably well aligned with my ideas. There doesn't have to be 100% alignment, but I don't want to accidentally say yes to someone who wants to discuss ways to reward and punish our kids into changing their behavior, for example. So I was in the middle of several things at the time, and I got about halfway through the book, and I'd folded down the corners on a lot of pages because I was finding the book so useful in terms of helping me to understand why validation helps us, and more specifically, how to do it. I reached back out to the publicist and I said, please go ahead and set up an interview. And then I kept reading the book. And a few days later, I got to the third of the three parts of the book, only to find out that it's about how to use validation to essentially reward people, including our partners and children, into changing their behavior to do what we want them to do. So I reached out to Dr. Fleck and her publicist and explained my dilemma, and I did use quite a few of my new validation skills in that message, and I acknowledged that she might not want to come on the show when I can't unequivocally recommend the book, while she's still in the excitement of the release period especially. She also mentions in the book that she has some pretty severe health challenges, and I thought she might want to protect her energy as well. But she graciously responded and said she'd be happy to come on and either discuss the challenges I have with part three of the book or have me append a conclusion of my own. And the first two parts of the book really are so useful, so we're going to focus on that in our conversation. And then I will wrap up with a conclusion on why I don't think the third part is as helpful. You'll get all the tools from the book from just our conversation, so feel free to skip the conclusion if these additional ideas won't be helpful to you. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Fleck. She is a licensed psychologist, corporate consultant, and adjunct clinical instructor at Stanford University. She received a BA in psychology and English from the University of Michigan, followed by an MA and PhD from the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. She's served as a supervisor and consultant for some of the most rigorous clinical training programs in the country, including Dr. Marsha Linehan's BRTC at the University of Washington, the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford Medical Center, and the VA Palo Alto. She's a respected voice in psychology and has been featured in national media outlets, including the New York Times, Good Morning America, and the Huffington Post. Welcome, Dr. Fleck. It's so great to have you here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And so I wonder if we can start with the basics. Would you be willing to define what you mean by validation?
Yeah. So by validation, we're talking about a way of communicating that you are mindful, you understand, and you empathize with some part of a person's experience, thereby accepting it as valid. That is a mouthful. So I like to truncate that to just validation shows that you're there, you get it, and you care, right? It's that feeling of being seen and heard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so why is that important in our relationships?
I believe that it is the most important quality in our relationships. In fact, I would argue that it's really hard to have authentic relationships in the absence of that. Because when we don't feel seen, who is the other person having a relationship with if it's not us? It could be a facade. It could be some version of us that they're holding on to. But when we don't feel seen in who we are, it's hard to feel loved, I think, for who we are.
Yeah. And it seems as though then what you're saying, particularly the mindfulness piece, is very different from I'm waiting for you to stop talking so I can say what's on my mind that I've been thinking about while you're talking.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you flagged that because I think that is how many of us, myself included, a lot of the time listen. But like as I describe in my book, validation really is a skill. And the first part of strengthening that skill is developing the ability to listen without your own agenda to talk. And that's kind of the first step is to make almost a mindfulness practice out of the conversation itself. And you can do that at any moment. You can do it in the middle of a conflict. You can do it just when you're driving to the store. But that is kind of the most fundamental level is, are you engaging in
Mhm.
participating in that way?
Yeah. Okay. And so I want to sort of make sure that we're getting the nuance of the three pieces. The mindfulness was the first piece, the understanding was the second piece. And I remember talking with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett on her work on how emotions are made and her idea that we sort of think we know what other people are thinking and feeling based on the arrangement of their facial features, when actually most of us are not very good at this.
Yeah, it's really surprising. Well, and not only are we not great at it, but most of us are pretty good at masking our actual emotions, right? So even if we do read whatever the facade is projecting, that is a very blurry representation of what the other person is actually experiencing. So
Yeah.
to be able to see past that is, again, it takes some skill.
Yeah. Okay. And then the empathy is the piece that you emphasized on really connecting with another person's emotions, which is so important to us.
Yeah, that's right. So the understanding I think of more as like a logical understanding, like I don't this is a very weird reference, but like Spock from Star Trek, almost like a very like, given X, Y makes sense. And then
Mhm.
empathy is more of like I don't know, Yoda kind of. It's this emotional intuition that incorporates the logical, but has this higher level of emotional understanding as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and so we're going to talk about a model in your book that I find incredibly helpful in
Oh,
terms of the validation ladder. And
yeah.
before we get there, I just want to lay a little bit of groundwork in terms of sort of how we validate people and what we validate. And one of your cardinal rules is to only validate the valid. And then you say that thoughts are considered valid when they are logical, based on facts, and grounded in reality. And the example you give is of a schizophrenic patient going off his meds who then thought that you were colluding with the government to get him killed, which obviously is not a valid thought because it wasn't true. And so this plays out in a variety of ways in our lives, right? Right now, we are in a political environment where the government has declared there are only two genders, which scientific research tells us is not fact. So, what is logical, fact-based, and grounded in reality seems highly contestable. How does that fit in with your validation framework?
That really surfaced. I can like vividly remember um watching, I can't remember who it was, but just that those words are like, the idea that facts are um debatable.
Hmm.
And when that first started to bubble up into kind of our culture and our rhetoric, the first thing I thought is exactly what you're describing, which is, what does this mean for our ability to determine what is valid in
Yeah.
terms of a thought process? Because validity is based on fact and science and data and logic. And once you suggest that those things are debatable, you have fundamentally uprooted our basis for determining validity. And
Mhm.
so it's a very good point. It's something I've run into so much and increasingly, it seems, every year for probably the last 5 or 6 years. And what I do with that when I'm really struggling to understand, how can somebody believe um, X, Y, or Z, given what we know, like you said, given the science on
Mhm.
this? And when I can't understand and I can't get on board with their logic, I can at the very least kind of zoom out and look at the context and see, okay, if a trusted authority was telling me that there are only two genders, and I was told that this was news, that this was factual information, I might believe that too.
Mhm.
So I can see the logic, so to speak, in their logic, even though I don't believe that it is logical. That is the most confusing sentence that was ever said out loud, much less on air. But here we are.
Yes, it's a confusing world we live in. So that fits in with another is one of the items on the ladder, right? Contextualizing, given what you are surrounded by, it makes sense that you would believe this. So okay, so that helps me. Thank you. And then I guess in a way, kind of pushing back on it from the other side, what I
Yes.
am hearing is sort of this very logical, rational perspective, typically associated with men
Yeah.
over, right, this sort of feminine approach of feminine air quotes
Hmm.
of knowing and intuiting. And you do
Mm.
say that all emotions are valid, which I totally agree with, but
Mhm.
I think sometimes we make decisions by intuiting, by just sort of a deep
Yes.
knowing rather than a rational, logical process. How does that fit in with validating the valid?
Yeah. So in a lot of this work comes from dialectical behavior therapy or DBT. And, we have this concept of wise mind in DBT, which is we want to make decisions based not just on logic, but also on that intuition. And so it's about the balance, but a deeply validating response is one that includes both that logical understanding and the emotional understanding. So I would argue that if you're only ever able to validate like the logical, again, there can be this like Spock-like quality to that communication. It fails to see some of the intuition and the emotional logic, so to speak, in a person's reaction. And so that's where, again, through these skills and this model, I hope to help people use that logic to take it one step further into the emotional understanding. And I do believe for everyone out there who struggles with this, I absolutely know that this is a skill set. This is something you can develop, right? So if you really struggle to get that other piece, this will help you do so.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let's make this super practical for parents, right? Like your
Thanks.
kid has a meltdown because their cracker breaks.
Yeah.
And they want their cracker to be whole again, and it was the last cracker in the bag.
I
And I'm
mean,
wondering
that's
if I
so
can,
frustrating.
yeah, I'm wondering if I can answer my own question. Is it the same as sort of the first part of this? Given the context that you're in and you're a three and this is a big deal to you,
Yeah.
it makes sense that you would be frustrated over the cracker breaking. Is that where you would go with validating the valid on the cracker?
I might also again kind of zoom back and see, all right, kiddo, did they skip a nap? Have they
Right.
not eaten in a while?
Mhm.
Because I remember when my daughter was younger, it's going to make me sound like a horrible parent. We had this rectangular dining table that had a really sharp corners. And no, no, Jen, we didn't cover the corners like rational parents would do. For some reason, we just thought she'd stop running into it. But no, she kept running into it. And if that kid had slept and eaten and she hit the corner, she was like,
Mhm.
ha ha ha, money, mommy, I'm so silly. She'd be okay. It might owie a little bit. If she
Mhm.
hadn't, it was like a complete meltdown, right? Same quote unquote trigger, like that table. She could have even hit it with the same intensity, but it was
Mhm.
really about the hunger, the exhaustion, all these other vulnerability factors that were coming into play. So
Mhm.
with a kiddo, who's maybe crying over a broken cracker, and they don't usually cry over such a thing. If their reaction seems outside the norm for them, I might zoom out and say, oh, okay, I think we should probably take it. Are you feeling a little tired? Yeah, I would still validate the emotion because they're still upset. Yeah, it is frustrating when that happens. Let's take a break. But I also need to attend to the other factors at play and ultimately help orient the kiddo to those factors so that they can make sense and understand their reactions.
Yeah. Okay. And so seeing that it's not really about the cracker
Yeah, 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 that's right.
and that there are even broader contexts than the cracker that this behavior makes sense within. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. And so why should we validate other people, right? How does it help us?
Oh boy. Again, and I'm so entrenched in this. Honestly, sometimes it's hard for me to think outside of it, but it's like to me that's as though you were to ask, why should we show love
Yeah.
or why should we have compassion? Um, because it is absolutely essential, because we as human beings are distinct from other animals in our need for acceptance and belonging. And I think it helps to see that as a fundamental need. When we want to, I mean, not want to, when we choose to torture people in this country, one of the forms we use is solitary confinement. And taking people away from other people is what deeply, traumatically hurts them. And I can't underline that enough. The need that we have to feel seen and heard. The more you can bring that into your relationships, the more you can provide that, the healthier those relationships will be, the less conflict you have, and the more effective you will be in those relationships and actually getting your needs met. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
which we can all agree is something that we want.
Yeah,
We can do
yeah.
it. And also it helps other people. And I think that a reason why parents can struggle to validate their kids' feelings is that they worry that they're creating something out of nothing, right? They're creating something their child is going to worry about that they were a little bit worried about before, and now it's going to turn into a big thing. Or
Mm,
their child has hurt themselves and it's not really bad, but if they validate them, they're going to have a huge meltdown on their hands because their kid is going to cry more. I know you
mm.
looked at some of the research on that topic. Can you tell us how you see the role of validating our kids' feelings in these kinds of situations fits?
Yeah, so let's take the one where the kiddo's starting to get worked up, right? And in that moment, I'm as focused on the power of attention. What we
Mm,
know is that attention can be pretty reinforcing. When my daughter was younger, she used to do this thing when she was starting to like cry or get upset. She would go and look in a mirror. I don't know if anyone else's kids do this. She would go and look in a mirror and then she would like get increasingly worked up. There
mm,
was this really, I don't know why she did it, but in those moments, absolutely layering on attention would not be effective in the sense that it would escalate things for her. It would dysregulate her further.
mm,
And in those moments, what I would do actually is more of a smooth and move. Like okay, let's go over here. Let's take a walk. Let's go outside. Let's put that down. Let's not play with it. Kind of take her out of the situation until she's regulated. Because as
mm,
a psychologist, I know that her system is flooded. She's in a state of sympathetic arousal. She's flipped her top, like she's not thinking clearly. And so, me trying to rationalize with her or even validate her, it's just we're not operating at that level. She's not operating at that level. Now, what I will do and what I think is critical to do is after she's calmed down, then I will go in and validate the valid, which
mm.
might be, yeah, you were really frustrated by how uncomfortable that shirt tag was. I don't like having things on me that are uncomfortable either. Oh, I hate it. Like if someone moves my eyebrows in that weird way, oh, I just can't stand that feeling. Like that makes total sense. So I can validate her emotion, the ickiness, the discomfort. Now, I don't necessarily need to validate the behavior of, let's say, tantruming and throwing things. Okay. Because I don't see validity in that. I don't think that's an effective way to deal with a shirt that hurts, um, or even an effective way to regulate those emotions. Sometimes it could be, depending on the circumstances, but oftentimes it's not. And so if I don't see it as valid, I wouldn't validate that.
Mm. Okay. I mean, if it got your attention when previously she hadn't been able to communicate that the shirt was irritating her, then we could argue that it was actually a fairly effective strategy.
And in fact, that's what a lot of kids from highly invalidating environments learn.
Mm,
They learn to escalate to a point that they get the attention they should be getting at lower levels.
mhm.
Right.
Okay.
So if a child says to you, my shirt is really uncomfortable, it hurts, it's stressing me out, that's something to take seriously. We shouldn't wait for them to melt down before we respond to something that's bothering them. Right. Now,
Yeah.
there may only be a certain number of things we can do, but we absolutely don't want our kids to have to tantrum to have their needs be heard and for them to be taken seriously.
Yeah, yeah. And when, of course, when you're thinking about this with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who
Yeah.
may not have the capacity to be able to even say, it's my shirt tag.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. So,
Yeah,
but we have to look at what's developmentally appropriate
yeah,
there as well,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm curious about gender differences in how this shows up. And I know that one of the studies you cite in your book talk about how fathers have been shown to respond to their children's emotions, including distressing emotions, in less supportive ways than mothers. And when I looked at the studies you cited that talked about how people learn validation, pretty often the researchers are saying, okay, who wants to learn about validation? And all the women are like, yep. And all the men are like, I don't know. And so what do you see in terms of men's ability to validate and willingness to learn about validating?
Oh, that's interesting. To speak to what you were saying also about the research, I'm so excited to be able to talk with someone about this, but I was really, frankly, disheartened. I'd
Mm,
done a lot of research on validation, and when I really started to dig into it, especially the effects on children and parent dynamics, so much of the research was just looking at mom's validation, the effects of mom's validation on children. And I frankly didn't always see good explanations as to why. I can hypothesize or whatever, but I I was disappointed by that. I think that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on women, first of all. Second of all, I think it invalidates the effects that fathers can have on their children and the significance of their role, particularly when it comes to modeling and validating emotion. Now, in terms of learning or developing these skills, I'd been teaching validation forever with my clients and therapy, with couples, parents. And I, at some point, was asked by Google to come and develop this interpersonal effectiveness class for a group of like 100 folks this group was really, team was really struggling to communicate effectively. And this was a group of pretty much almost all men, uh, mostly engineers, and those who weren't engineers were hard science researchers. And I thought, this is not going to go over well. I was like, frankly, I was so intimidated, me going in there with my soft skills, you know. And what surprised me was how quickly these folks not only developed these skills, but the interest they showed in them.
mm,
And that is part of why I wrote this book. It was after that experience of seeing, like, oh no, this really resonates. What I found in that situation was an appreciation for the method. Like, oh, this is almost like an algorithm I can use, this validation ladder, this framework I created. I can plug into this. I know what to do when the person does responds negatively. I can just go back here. It was really sweet to see that the desire actually was there. I think a lot of the resistance was coming from a sense of hopelessness or inability to achieve or actually succeed in validating people. But once I gave them that path, it was like, oh, give me more.
yeah. Okay. And that's that. Now you phrase it in that way. That's a big part of what I got out of it as well was,
Mm.
oh, this makes sense. Okay. I'm doing these already. Here's one where I'm not, not doing as well. Here's where I can focus to improve my skills.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Yes.
so that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Cool. Cool.
So,
Cool.
okay, so we're about to get there. Before we get there, the one last thing I want to address is, what happens if we don't receive these messages that our experience and our thoughts and our feelings is valid?
So when we're not validated, often what happens is what we receive instead is invalidation. When we don't feel heard, we're often internalizing the message that your voice doesn't matter. Your emotions don't matter. You shouldn't be thinking that way. You shouldn't be acting that way. You certainly shouldn't be feeling that way. And this is one of the single greatest contributors to mental health problems that we know of. This isn't a maybe that invalidation is problematic. This is no, it is absolutely problematic. It is exponentially, uh, folks who are exposed to pervasive invalidation are exponentially more likely to self-harm, to suicide, to develop serious problems like major depressive disorder, borderline personality disorder, psychopathy. I mean, it really is, it's like the root of all evil in a lot of ways. So I cannot emphasize how important it is. And I say in the, like, even if you don't develop the ability to validate, please, please at least work on decreasing invalidation because it is so toxic.
Yeah. And that brings to mind a theory that I have, which is that, I think a lot of things we call mental illness are actually at their root an absence of validation. And that we're essentially saying, our culture is like this and you can't cope with that. And therefore, the problem is with you. You need to go and fix what's wrong with you, which is the opposite of validation, because a validating culture would say something like, oh my goodness, you're having a hard time. What is it about our culture, our environment that you're in that is hard for you? And how can we all work together to support you in a way that you need to be supported? And do you see it in a similar way? Would you push back against elements of that?
No, no, I would underline that, highlight that. That is truth.
Mm,
Um, there is no way that you can learn to trust your emotions and navigate your environment if you are consistently told that what you are thinking and feeling is wrong.
mm,
How can you feel seen if you don't even trust who you are? That is a confusing and hopeless way to experience life. And in the context of that hopelessness, that loneliness, that sense of shame, most people will resort to desperate attempts to cope or avoid that quote unquote reality.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is why it's both so important and so hard, I think, because we're trying to build the plane as we're flying it, right? To use an
Mm.
overused metaphor, which is to say that our parents didn't validate us. And so somehow we have to learn from an awesome book that's so helpful how to receive and give something that we never received when we were little, and do this for our kids in moments when they're looking for validation. And there's this part of us screaming inside ourselves, but nobody did this for me
For
when I was a
me.
kid.
It's true. It's true. My only other kind of hopeful note there is that it's absolutely possible to develop a self-validation practice
Mm,
wherein you develop the skills to validate yourself and your own experiences. That takes time because, as you said, for most of us, it wasn't modeled frequently. We are a very critical culture. We're very focused on solving problems. We're not as focused on accepting people's reactions to problems or their reactions to their environments. And so you can develop it. It takes a lot of work and intention. It's possible. I talk about how to do it. But another promising note there is that in my experience, the better you get at validating others, the more easy it is for you to validate yourself. Those two
mm,
things just go hand in hand. Once you start working that muscle and seeing people through that lens, it does turn inward as well.
mm. Okay, that's helpful and hopeful.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, so I want this episode to be super practical for parents, and so
sure.
I wanted to kind of work through the validation ladder. So can you start by just I mean, obviously we know we can picture a ladder, but it has a
Yeah.
specific, tripartite structure. So can you describe that to us so we can have that image in our minds as we move through the steps?
Sure, sure. So as I said at the top of the hour, validation is composed of kind of mindfulness, understanding, and empathy. And we broke that down. So the validation ladder has 8 skills that map onto one or more of those qualities. So at the bottom of the ladder, the most basic skills we talk about are these two kind of mindfulness sub skills. And using these 2 skills will help you show that you are engaged, you are mindful, and most importantly, that you are not being judgmental. Okay, so that's the aim of those 2 skills. So it doesn't matter whether or not I like or agree with the person across from me. I should, at the bare minimum, always be able to remain mindful and to project that in some way. Again, validation is communication. So we're focused on the communication of that awareness or that attentiveness. Okay. And we've got 2 skills there. A step up from there is understanding. We have 3 ways of communicating understanding in a way that actually also projects mindfulness. So if you're able to access those skills, great. Now, if you really get it, if you're present, you understand and you feel, you empathize, then you can use our top 3 kind of empathy skills that not only communicate mindfulness and understanding, but show that you care, you feel it, you're there. It's as though the other person is looking at themselves in a mirror when they look at you. That is the ultimate kind of experience. And so
Hmm.
that's the structure of the ladder. And again, it kind of moves from very accessible to you've got to really feel it to be able to communicate these skills. And also, they get trickier. um, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that description. And we're going to talk about what are each of the skills within that ladder. And so a couple of things that you emphasize in the book that I want to make sure come out here are there the sub skills within each of the three segments are interchangeable in terms of their placement on the ladder. So
Yeah.
it's not that, the skill number one in mindfulness is more difficult is easier than skill number two in mindfulness. It's within mindfulness, which is the easier of the skills. So that
Patrick.
the levels refer to the categories rather than to the individual skills themselves. And then the second point that I think is important is the higher you go, the harder you fall.
Yes.
And so
It's so true.
if we fail, what should we do?
So, fortunately, there's not much at stake with the mindfulness skills. Like, you're not
Mhm.
likely to strike out terribly by attending non-judgmentally to someone. So, if you fail in your attempts to try maybe one of the higher validation skills, if you really wipe out and the person is like, no, that's not what's going on for me, you can always go back to those mindfulness skills. That is what we do. That is the process of developing these skills. It is this series of wipeouts and then returning and resetting and trying again. And that is how you hone it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. So let's start at the bottom of the ladder then with our
Yeah,
mindfulness skills. And there are two of those, attend and copying.
that's right.
So what is attending? Hopefully
Yeah,
you're getting some of this through our conversation.
yeah, yeah. So attending is just again paying attention non-judgmentally and projecting that in some way to communicate that quality. You've got a couple of ways to go about it. I'll focus on two. The first is to play this little game in your head uh, where you're trying to solve, as someone is speaking to you, you're trying to figure out what is this person's point? Like, what are they trying to say? Why does it matter to them? What's going on here? And then, crucially, how could I do a better job of making that point? Now, that sounds judgmental, and that's not what I mean that's not where we're going here. Instead, it's almost if you've ever seen like a late night host or like an Oprah Winfrey, these folks interviewing people, they are completely focused on the guest and trying to pull out the most concise, interesting version of this person's story that they can. They're kind of helping them in that way. That is how to attend.
Mm,
You're trying to join the person in creating their message rather than just sitting back and going like, this is how I'm going to react to this. This is what I'm going to say instead. Here's my rebuttal. So rather than fixating on what you're going to say, you focus on what they're trying to say. You don't have to even communicate that. It's just a game you're playing in your head. It's like a little solitaire. Uh, and you're just kind of ping-ponging as you're listening between like, what's their point? How can I sharpen it? What's the point here? Why does this matter? Let me sharpen it. Let me sharpen it. And
mhm,
that's, if you do that, you will naturally find yourself asking questions, doing things like this naturally, that again demonstrate that engagement. Okay.
mhm.
So that's the first part.
Is a well-placed for you.
I appreciate it. The other important quality to attending is nonverbals. And nowhere did this become more obvious to me, like the importance of nonverbals, as when we went into lockdown. And all of a sudden, so much of our communication was limited to Zoom, video conferencing, everything else. And this was before we all had good cameras and like stuff like that, right? This was a really
Ring light.
crude days. Yeah, right, right. It was really crude. And you could feel the loss in connection. And part of what we were responding to in those moments was the lack of this very critical way of communicating, and that is through body language, nodding, eye contact. Eye contact is so tricky over VC because you're often not looking at the person, you're looking slightly down. Even hand gestures, right? Just little ways of showing momentum or enthusiasm, leaning forward, all of that is compromised. And yet we know that those simple nonverbals, nodding, eye contact, gestures, proximity, kind of being closer to, all of that functions to increase a sense of connection.
Mhm.
Um, so that's
Okay.
attending. Yeah, it's that
Okay.
combination of nonverbals and asking yourself those questions.
Right. And so as we're asking ourselves that question, right, how could I make this person's point for them? I think we may end up asking them questions to further understand them. And I think that's the part that's really important, right? Because when
Mhm.
we're in a sort of typical disagreement with somebody, we might ask a question, but it's not really a question for looking to understand an answer. It's a question for to make a point, right? Well,
That's
how
right.
could you possibly think X when I actually said Y, right? That's not a question that's going to further our understanding of this person's position. So.
That is absolutely right. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So that's attending, and
Mhm.
then the next rung of the ladder, still within our initial mindfulness space, is copying. So tell us about copying.
Copying is one of my favorite little skills because it's so freaking easy and it also sounds really bizarre. But once you start practicing it intentionally, uh,
Mhm.
you will see the power in it. So copying is what it sounds like. I want you to repeat the words somebody uses or just kind of echo back or mirror what somebody has said. That is a version of copying. You're copying their words. And or you can copy their ways. You can, if they cross their arms, you cross their arms. They bring a hand to the chin, you bring a hand to the chin. I know what you're thinking. That sounds incredibly mechanical and weird. And here's the thing, guys. We all do this naturally. So we are hardwired to copy. As babies, little babies copy their caregivers' facial expressions. And in so doing, copying activates what's known as mirror neurons. We are actually able to mirror or experience some of what the other person is feeling through that mimicry. This is critical because, as I said before, working those basic validation skills, like these two mindfulness skills, helps you develop the understanding and empathy you might need to validate at a higher level. And this is one of the way, a very obvious way in which to do so. And I could geek out on the research on this all day. Like it's so fun, all the different experiments they've done of having, researchers copy or not copy participants without them knowing. And yeah, so I will make the point that you naturally copy people that you are attracted to, that you want to impress, that you find interesting. We do that by design. We're less likely to do it when we dislike, disagree, are angry with the other person. And in these moments, or we experience them as other, outside. These are the moments when copying will serve you best, because those are the moments when connection is often not there and most needed.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to sort of dig in just a tiny bit on the sort of copying the words.
Mm,
If you're saying, I'm feeling really tired, and I say, oh, you're feeling really tired, that sort of rote copying of the exact
yeah,
words you said is probably not getting you to where you want to go, right? So how
right,
what should we be doing instead of the actual, repeating of the words that the other
right,
person?
right. So just there at the end of your sentence, you said, you said this type of rote copying is probably not what we're going for, right? And then I said, right,
Yep,
right, back
yep.
at you. Okay. So I'm plucking out a single word that you said, and I am repeating it. I'm not going verbatim, repeating exactly what you said. I'm also not doing the infamous, I hear you saying you're frustrated, which for some reason, like that really gained steam in like the 80s or something. I don't know. And now I work with couples and one partner will say to the other, well, I hear you saying, you feel overwhelmed. And there's just something about it that's like, there's something invalidating about it. It's not that.
Well, there's also, I mean, if it's coming out in that tone, there's also
Yeah, true.
there's some attending skills missing there, right?
That's
Because the
right.
person has not actually been attending. They've been listening and thinking, how dare they say that they're feeling overwhelmed or whatever the thing is, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But the point with copying isn't to make a huge production out or draw
Yeah.
attention away from the other person. I'm just trying to signal attunement.
Yeah.
And I do that by, like I said, plucking out a word, especially if it's like a rich adjective that the other person used or an emotional adjective, frustration, disappointment. Those are the real PowerPoints. Yeah, I'm gonna not PowerPoint, but you know what I mean.
Or words.
Power words. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The hit.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right. So that's within our sort of bottom rung of our validation ladder. So let's
Hmm.
move into the middle set of skills on the ladder, right? The
Yeah.
understanding skill set. And we already touched on contextualize a bit when we talked about, yeah, given where the people that you listen to, the news media that you get your information from, I can see why you would think this thing that scientific research says is potentially not the truth. Given all the things that are happening in your life, child, and you didn't get a nap this morning and you're hungry and all the other things that were happening, it makes sense that you would feel frustrated that the cracker broke. So,
Yeah.
so it seems we've had those examples of contextualizing. What else do we need to know about contextualizing?
Yeah, contextualizing is really helpful. So by contextualizing, I mean you're seeing someone's reaction in the moment and it doesn't immediately make sense to you.
Mm.
All right. So I given the example of if I am at a PTA meeting and we're sitting in a classroom and then a door slams down the hall and two-thirds of the parents duck under their chairs as though a bomb had gone off. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I would have a hard time validating why I mean, it was a loud noise, but we're in like California. It was clearly a door. What's going on? Now, when two-thirds of a group did that exact same thing when I was teaching at the VA, a group for veterans who had just returned from active duty, that behavior made total sense to me for those folks. Even though they, I think, were embarrassed and there was just a sense of disappointment almost palpably in that room for those folks. Of course, their behavior made sense because I understood the larger context. And that's where contextualizing is helpful. It's helpful in making sense of a reaction that doesn't immediately make sense in the moment, given just what you have. Now,
Yeah.
is that clear enough? I should ask before I go
Yes,
into
yes,
it. Yeah.
yes. No, I think it is. And there were a couple of things that I thought were particularly helpful about contextualizing in viewing it as it's the opposite of you should be able to, right? You are old enough to be able
Yes.
to do X, you should be able to do X, which compares our child to another child, which compares our child to a theoretical child who can do this, right? And your VA example, you're a grown man, you can hear that this is a door slamming. Why are you under the table? Right? This comparing these people to somebody who has healed or who doesn't
Right.
have a hard time hearing a door slam. It doesn't help the person.
Yes. I'm
So,
I'm I'm really glad you mentioned that point because it gives me just a split second here to make another point that I really think is so important for parents, which is that we need to drop the you're too old. You're 8 years old. You're too old to be having tantrums. You're too old for this. You're too old for that. So and so doesn't do that. Does your friend, Mikey punch people when they're and that message is invalidating and it's shaming. All right. As an adult, I would be so hurt if someone said to me, Caroline, you're 40 something years old. You're not exercising every day. I mean, what's wrong with you? You've been hearing this, you know all the research. I mean, all your friends do it. What's wrong with you? Right? When we
yeah,
think about it in those terms, it's very hurtful. So, yes, the behavior might not be effective in the moment. And you can speak to that. That's fine to target. I can say, yeah, Mikey, punching people doesn't work. I can understand why you do it. I can understand that you're frustrated. I think that's a valid emotion. It may have even been modeled for you. I understand your brother punches you all the time. I can see why that would be a natural response to this situation. The problem is, it doesn't work here. Let's talk about what you can do instead. So I can validate the valid, which is the emotion and where that behavior comes from, that there is a context in which it made sense, but that is not now.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think you and I have some slight differences in our perspective on
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
where
yeah.
to go with this information,
Yeah,
which we will get to possibly after our conversation ends. And so I think, where you see, this isn't the moment for this behavior, I see
yeah.
what is the need that is driving this and how can I help you to meet that need? So
Yes,
that we can't, so that you don't, you don't want to hit because your need is met, because by and large, we don't hit when our needs are met.
that's exactly what I'm looking for. So there's a bit of what we call functional analysis that
Mhm.
is inherent in contextualizing. I'm looking at like where is this coming from and what function does it serve?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want this person to understand that they hurt you, how can you deliver that message more effectively? Because the behavior of punching them doesn't
Mhm.
get that need met. Now, it's a valid need, and I'm going to
Mhm.
validate that. However, I'm not going to say it's cool for you to punch him or even that's okay. I get it. No,
Yeah.
it's not okay. I
Yes.
get it, and it's not okay. But it is, you do need to get that need met. So let's find something that is okay and that scratches that itch and that gets your need met.
Great.
Yeah, very
Thank you.
nuanced, right? We're
Yes.
really into it. But I think this is important because this is where this stuff gets so tricky
Yeah.
in parenting, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And as a tool to help us get there, it reminded me of Alfie Kohn's words, always assume the best possible intention consistent with the observed behavior, which sounds like a
Mm.
mouthful, right? But
No,
essentially
it's,
what we're doing is we're contextualizing. That's what he's encouraging us to do.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. So that's the first of the understanding. The second of the understanding skills is equalizing, which is the idea that anyone in your shoes would do the same thing, which is a
Mhm.
core element of Dr. Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion, I think.
That's right. Yes.
So I'm sort of curious. I don't know what you're going to say about this. Is it right to say that we should contextualize or equalize, but not both?
Yeah, you typically don't need both. So equalizing is just the person's reaction, their response makes perfect sense in
Mhm.
that moment, given what you have,
Right.
right? Or given what you know about the situation. You don't really need to abstract anything.
Mm.
So a parent raising concerns about the fact that the teaching is all going to be remote this year at a PTA meeting, that makes perfect sense to me. I don't need to extract anything. It's not like they hid under their chair or I'm like,
Yes.
that doesn't fit here. So when a
Yeah.
person's reaction just is understandable and immediately so to me, I can do that beautiful, of course. Anyone in your shoes would feel that way.
Yeah.
And I want to clarify that equalizing isn't any better or stronger than contextualizing. As you had mentioned
Mhm.
before, these are all just understanding skills. It kind of just depends on the situation, which one you can pull from to convey understanding. So
Yeah.
equalizing you would use when you just immediately get it. It makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then the third idea within the understanding skill set is proposing, right?
Yeah.
Sharing an idea about what you think the other person is thinking or feeling or wanting to do based on what they've said already in the conversation and what you know about their situation. And I think this is where we start to get into some of the like, I don't know if I can do this. What if I get it
Yeah.
wrong? Kind of skills. So what do you want us to know about proposing?
Okay, so first of all, I want y'all to know that this is like a Jedi mind trick. When you get good at proposing, you all of a sudden have a this seamless way of connecting deeply with people and quickly with people. And it is just so beautiful. I want to like wrap this in a gift and give it to everybody because it's so it's so powerful to be able to say what somebody else might have been thinking or feeling and articulate that before they even did,
Yeah.
right?
So can you give us an example? Like
Yeah,
how can parents think, oh yeah, now I know what proposing is?
yeah. So let me think of a good okay, this is a heavy example, but I'll use it. I was treated for breast cancer just shortly before publishing this book. and I lost my hair. And my daughter has struggled a lot with the change in my appearance and obviously with the whole experience. And to her, I feel very different than I
Mm.
was before. I feel like a different person to her. Um, and she attributes that change to me losing my hair.
Mm.
And so she'll say things like, Mommy, can you just go back to being the mom that you were?
Oh.
Which hits me very deeply and is painful. And to be honest, it's something I find myself at times pushing back against or wanting to push back against and say, no, I am your mom. I still love you the same. Nothing's changed. And I have said that at times ineffectively and corrected afterward. But if I propose here and say, because nobody else sees what she sees, and this is kind of maddening for her. Like everyone acts like nothing has changed, but it's changed. And if I say things are different, in a way, it's like you're, and she understands the concept of mourning, but it's like you're mourning somebody and nobody else sees it. And in that situation, she hasn't said that. As a child, I imagine she hasn't even conceptualized it in those terms. But if I am able to see that, and if it's accurate, if it kind of fits with what she's experiencing, that is a profound moment of like, you get it. You are able to put words to something and describe something that I was struggling. Not only do you not judge me for it or feel criticized, or hurt by what I'm saying, you see me better as a result. And so that is an extreme example, but I think it kind of shows what we're going for or the potential there. Proposing doesn't have to always be this huge, insight. It could, if someone's yawning, you could say, oh, you must be tired. Like on some level, that's proposing.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the potential of that skill.
Yeah, and I wonder if it for you is so like because it really seems like it is something that hits you right when she says that. I'm
It
wondering if
does.
it's well, there's part of me that hasn't changed and I still love you and I still want to show up as your mom, and also there's part of me that really has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those
Mm-hmm.
things I see as learning and growth and I like it, and some of it like I kind of just wish I could go back to how I was before.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Especially with like the physical stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, this is not how I'm used to looking or feeling or any number of things. Like, it's weird. It's totally weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oof, okay.
Yeah. Heavy.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Thank you.
Yes.
No, no, please don't apologize. I'm grateful for the gift of sharing that with us. And so one thing I want to touch on is sometimes our proposals fall flat,
Yeah.
right? And you have this idea in your book of a dial where there's at one end of the dial there's an idea, and at the other end of the dial there's like a fact. Like I'm going to state this as if it is actually true, and that
Yeah.
we can use that dial, right? And just now, I kind of made a proposal to you, right? I proposed how you might be feeling, and I began with, I wonder if, because we
Yes.
don't know each other that well, and I don't know if that's
Right.
true for you, right? So I
Right.
dialed that down pretty far, and
Yes.
so I think that can help us to not fall flat. What do we do if we do fall flat?
Proposing is one of the skills that you have to be prepared to strike out on because
Mm,
if you are going to get good at this, it takes a lot of trial and error.
mm,
And the error can feel, we feel unseen in the moment, right? If I was to respond negatively to that, to be like, no, that's not accurate. Like, Jen, what are you talking about? Like, you're going to feel like judged and,
yeah,
everything else. And so our inclination when we get it wrong is to pull back. We tell ourselves things like, I don't want to make it worse. I've screwed this up, or they don't get me, right? We just get defensive and we shut down. Worst thing you can do. What you need to do instead is go back to those attending skills
mm,
and just start playing that game in your head again of what's this person's point? How could I do a better job of making that point? Because if you get it wrong, then you clearly don't actually understand. And that is what, the understanding skills are intended to communicate. So if you missed it, you got to work on your understanding. Here's the thing. Most people, 9 out of 10 times, welcome the opportunity to be understood. They
Yeah.
appreciate you putting in that legwork and not disengaging.
Right.
And so as painful as it can feel in the moment, it's just stay in the game. Stay in the game.
Yeah.
And you can then propose again later once you get more information.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Awesome. We are getting close on time and we've got our empathy
Yes.
skill
Ooh,
to run through. So I'm going to set the stage here and then I'm going to kind of let you pick how
sure.
you want to go into this, right? So
Yeah.
within the empathy skill set, we've got taking action, which is taking
Mhm.
action on other people's behalf. We've got emoting, sharing how you're feeling about what the other person is sharing. And then finally, disclosing. So validating the other person's worth by demonstrating that you get their experience by sharing something similar that may have happened to you. So, what do you want to emphasize that you think is really important, especially for parents in their relationship with their kids as well as with their co-parents?
Yeah, I think probably one of the strong of those three,
Yeah.
the most effective with children and teens is often disclosure.
Mhm.
So if especially, I mean, and so now with young kids, they idolize you, right? And so if you're able to say, like, when I was your age, I had a similar reaction, or and did I ever tell you about the time I didn't make the soccer team? And X, Y, and Z. So if you can do that in a way that doesn't trump their experience,
Yes,
right?
that's really important.
Really important. And that doesn't minimize it because for some reason, as parents, we really, and I was so disappointed to realize this as a parent. I did have the urge to have the like back in my day, we didn't have computers. You had to use a phone. Like, and, and
And
my
only one person could talk at once in
yeah, yeah, and there
the
was
house.
a busy signal and like and when I disclose in those ways, I'm not actually showing that I understand what my agenda there is to kind of like grieve or say you've got it so well. You've got it so good, I should say. Um, Similarly, I don't want the conversation to become about me. So this is I very much see validation as an exercise in mindfulness. You are attending to the other person. If it becomes all about you, you've lost your focus. So this is a very effective skill, but just again, the higher we go up the ladder, the harder it hurts when you fall. And if you screw this one up, you lose the connection for a moment. You can regain it by attending, but that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Um, Emoting is also a really important one. I just want to do a shout out to my dads out there. I think expressing vulnerable emotions is okay. You need to obviously not be leaning on your children for emotional support by any means, but young boys seeing real vulnerable emotion expressed in adult men helps them feel seen and safe in their own emotions. Okay, this is very important. And we know that validation from fathers on their sons in particular, their sons' emotions, is very important and can be preventative in terms of mental health problems.
All right, so thank you so much for being here, Dr. Fleck. It's really been an honor to hear more about your work. And I know you and I have some differing opinions, and I've shared with you that I'm going to record a conclusion for
Yeah.
after this episode. And so that will sort of share some of the ways in which our approaches to using this information that I think is so, so helpful are
Yeah.
going to support parents. And so I wonder, just can you wrap up by telling us where can we find the book? Where can we find more information about you if we want to learn more?
Absolutely. So my book is available wherever you get books, Amazon, Audibles, Barnes and Noble, you name it, you'll find it. My website has bonus material from behind the book that I'm just publishing, I think, today. So that's
Oh,
exciting. You can find me at drcarolinefleck.com. I'm on Instagram and TikTok. Again, drcarolinefleck.com. Yeah, that should be
all
it.
right. Thank you so much. It
Thank
was
you,
really fun
Jen.
to dig into that. I
It
appreciate it.
really was. Thank you so much. And thank you for reading and have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I found tremendous value in Dr. Fleck's explanations of validation in the first two parts of her book. I'd like to share some thoughts about the third part, which focuses on behavioral change and why I take a different approach. So, Dr. Fleck is a therapist who works with a therapeutic approach called dialectical behavior therapy. And this helps clients learn how to manage their emotions, improve relationships, and tolerate difficult situations by helping them to identify problematic behaviors and replace them with more effective ones. Tools like DBT serve an important purpose in clinical settings where adults have specifically sought help for behaviors that are causing them distress. The question that I'd like to explore is whether these same approaches are appropriate as first-line strategies with children. I know that from an outside perspective, therapeutic approaches can seem a bit like a menu where all of the options are equally valid, but I see them as tools that each have a role in helping us depending on what we're struggling with. As you probably know from listening to the podcast, I believe that understanding our needs should always be the first strategy we try. Most of the time, we engage in behavior because we're trying to meet our needs, and our kids are doing that too. If we jump right to trying to change anyone's behavior, whether it's ours or our children's, without considering our needs, we're missing something important. An example I often use is a child jumping on the couch. In my view, we have to understand why the child is jumping on the couch. If they're jumping because they have needs for joy and play and movement, and we're feeling worried the couch might break, we can ask if they'd be willing to jump on the bed if that's more structurally sound, or maybe run up and down outside. But if they're jumping on the couch because we've told them not to do it before, because they have a need for connection, and they know that jumping on the couch is a reliable way to get our attention, then asking them to jump on the bed won't work. If we have a need for mental space and ease, we might see if they'd like a hug or for us to read a story to them. And then both of our needs get met, and neither one of us has to have our behavior changed to meet the other one's needs. Tools like DBT absolutely have a place in supporting adults' mental health. There are times when we can see what our need is and we can't meet it using the tools we have available to us. We might know that we want our child to learn how to explore risk on their own, but when it actually comes down to seeing them climb a tree, we can't take it. There's a mismatch between our values and goals for our children and our ability to live in alignment with those values because of our thoughts and beliefs. DBT is really useful in those kinds of situations because it helps us to change the way we think about them. But here's the thing, when you sign up to do DBT, you know what you're getting into. You're consenting to have your thoughts changed by someone else because you've tried to meet your needs first and it hasn't helped. I think this gets much more problematic when we're thinking about using these tools with our kids, who for the most part have not consented to having these tools used on them. I think it's especially misplaced to use these tools as a first-line strategy to deal with children's behavior, because we're essentially saying the only thing I care about is that your behavior changes. DBT is a behaviorist approach, which means the behavior is the only thing that matters. When the behavior changes, the therapy has been successful. Dr. Fleck explains that she believes this herself. She says, of course, there needs to be consequences for problematic behavior. I could refer to all of the parenting research that substantiates this point, but I don't need to because if you spend any time around kids, then you know that they're like little Jurassic Park dinosaurs who will destroy the park and probably kill you when they realize the fence is off. Consequences, punishments, contingencies, whatever you call them, are important. Period. The question isn't about whether or not you use them, it's how you use them. End quote. And when I read this, I almost went cross-eyed. How did a book on validation end up here? There is one form of punishment that Dr. Fleck won't ever consider giving a child, and that is emotional invalidation. You should always validate their emotions, but not their problematic behavior. As an example, she says we shouldn't say to our child, this isn't something to cry about. We should say, it's okay to be sad and upset. It's not okay to scream. To me, this is another version of I love you, I just don't like your behavior that sounds so logical from the parent's perspective and so maddeningly patronizing from the child's perspective. And I noticed an interesting contradiction here. When we talked, Dr. Fleck wisely pointed out that telling a child you should be able to do whatever task we've decided they should be able to do, which compares them to a theoretical child who can do the thing we're asking, creates shame and is invalidating. Yet in the book, she uses an example about her daughter Havana's hairbrushing, essentially saying, you're old enough to brush your own hair because Havana has arms and a brush. This approach seems to contradict her point about contextualization. Sometimes a child might be physically able to do something, but still need support because they had a tough day at school or need connection. It's similar to how we would appreciate our partner taking out the trash for us after a difficult day at work, even though we're physically capable of doing it ourselves and it's a task we normally do. When we make ourselves the judge of whether the child's behavior is acceptable or not, we put ourselves in a position of power over them. Dr. Fleck was trained in Dr. Alan Kasdan's method. He was the director of the Yale Parenting Center and Child Conduct Clinic, and he uses, you guessed it, behaviorist-based ideas to shape children's behavior. Excessively excited praise when the child does what the parent says, rewarding small steps toward the behavior you want to see with tokens that they can cash in for a treat, timeouts. It's all in Kasdan's method, and Dr. Fleck is right there with him. As long as we don't invalidate children's emotions, all the other behaviorist-based tools are fair game. Now, I'm not debating that there isn't decades of research out there that speaks to the effectiveness of these methods. There is. But we have to ask, effectiveness at what? Is changing our children's behavior our only goal? If so, behaviorist-based tools are the ones to use. But if we care about our children's inner experience, then we're kind of on shaky ground here because behaviorism doesn't take this into account. Behaviorism is about changing behavior, although we might see this as manipulation. Dr. Fleck addresses this directly by saying that, quote, these days, I think most of us see technologies like artificial intelligence as a greater threat to the enslavement of the human race, but I still want to address the behaviorism equals manipulation concern as it pertains to validation because it comes up from time to time. When it does, I reiterate that validation is the authentic communication of acceptance. I agree with this point. I think Dr. Fleck's work to explain how to authentically communicate acceptance is masterful. But is it really then acceptance if we use the connection we've built through validation to try to change the child's behavior? So let's take an example, right? Let's imagine that you yell at your kid after you've already promised them that you're not going to yell at them anymore, and you and I get on the phone so that you can tell me about it. I could pay close attention to you as you explain what happened, and then say something like, "Oh my goodness, you were sleep deprived, and your partner woke the baby up early, and your older child had a cold, and you yelled at them for not getting dressed fast enough. Of course you did." And so I'm copying you, right? Think back to the skills that we learned in the conversation. Any parent would have lost it in that situation. Equalizing skill. You aren't a crappy parent. You're an awesome parent having a crappy day. Do you worry that you won't ever be able to stop yelling? So there's a tentative proposal about what might be going on for you. And maybe I wait for your answer, and then I might say, I once yelled at my daughter in a situation like that where I didn't get enough sleep and she did something really small and I just lost it. Does it happen often when you don't get enough sleep? And so I'm disclosing something about myself and then returning the conversation to you as I'm supposed to using these validation tools. And then I could go on to say, now, are you feeling good about our connection? I know I am. So how about we discuss the reward system I'm going to set up to get you to stop yelling at your kids? Each hour that you don't yell at them, you can put a cotton ball in a jar. And at the end of the week, you can exchange 50 cotton balls for a trip to Starbucks. How are you feeling about our connection now? Maybe you're wondering what on earth gives me the right to decide how your behavior should change. Maybe you're feeling pissed off that I use the connection to get close to you and then set up the reward system, which now puts me in a position of judging your behavior. Are you likely to want to share how you're feeling with me again? In this method, it doesn't matter why you're yelling. It doesn't matter if your child's behavior reminded you of a traumatic experience you had in childhood, or that you're completely overwhelmed at work, or that you're neurodivergent. All that matters after we've validated you is that your behavior changes to meet my standard. When we look at it from the perspective of two adults in the interaction, it doesn't look so great, does it? It only seems acceptable when we're talking about children's behavior because we're so used to using our power over them. And let's not forget why it's appropriate to use our power over them. If I annoyed you by using our connection and to then try and shape your behavior as I coached you, you could just decide, hey, no more coaching from Jen for me. And you might regret that things have turned out the way they did between us, but it's not like you and I are in a super close relationship. But with your kids, it's another story. Remember from the episodes on time out that those researchers say it's because our children look to us for love and care, as well as privileges like screen time and being taken to activities they enjoy, that we can and should use that relationship to shape their behavior. If you decide you don't like my coaching, you can go find another coach or talk to a friend or just try and figure it out yourself. You're in a consent-based relationship with me, and if you don't consent to work with me, the work doesn't happen. If you go to a DBT therapist, you know what you're signing up for. You consent to the treatment plan. Your kid can't go and find themselves another parent. Your kid has to figure out how to still get love and care from you, and most often they do that by hiding the parts of themselves that you don't like and you don't want to see, and showing more of the parts of themselves that you do, which is what the behaviorists say is a good thing. But I work with thousands of parents who have been profoundly hurt by that shaping. And it's one thing to use those tools not knowing how much they can hurt, which is mostly what our parents did, right? It's entirely another thing to know that and to use them anyway. Most likely, if we're thinking about using these tools with our kids, we don't have their consent. And if we do tell them what we're doing, we're probably explaining the parts about rewards they're going to like, but probably not the part about how we want them to hide the parts of themselves we don't want to see anymore. Because if we did that, would they consent to participate? So what should we do once we've created all that goodwill in the relationship through validation? Because this is the part 3 of the book that I wanted to see. The book helps us to build this amazing connection through validation, and I was hoping we could then use that connection to understand each other's needs, because that's where we actually get to the root of why the child is behaving in the way they are. They're doing it to meet a need. Whatever it is we're wishing they wouldn't do, they're doing it to meet a need. So when we see that behavior and we wish it wasn't happening, we can make a choice. Do I use behaviorist-based tools to just get them to stop doing it? Or do I try to understand why they're doing it, what need they're trying to meet, and then help them to meet that need in a way that also meets my need? And if that answer isn't fully clear to us, what would we hope that other adults would do with us? Dr. Fleck says that, quote, I, for one, wish more people would try to manipulate me with acceptance and validation. But I, for one, do not wish that. There's also a chapter in the book on how to shape your partner's behavior to increase the amount of work they do around the house. And if your partner has already flat out refused to help you, then I don't really see an ethical problem with using these tools to try to get them to collaborate a bit more. But what if your partner finds the book on your nightstand and decides to shape your behavior to be better aligned with what they want without your consent? Would you want that to happen? If the answer is that you wouldn't want your partner to do it to you, then you might want to think twice about doing it to your partner or your child. I highly recommend the first 2 parts of Dr. Fleck's book. I'm already using what I learned in it in my personal relationships as well as my coaching. The 3rd part contains techniques that may be helpful in specific situations, but I really do encourage you to consider how these approaches align with your values about parent-child relationships and consent before you apply them. Thanks so much for being here with me in this episode today. And don't forget that Dr. Fleck's book on validation, as she mentioned, can be bought where all books are sold.